The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History Magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History Magazine. On December 18th, 1900, Pat Crowe and an associate kidnapped 15-year-old Edward A. Cudahy Jr., son of a wealthy Omaha meatpacker, and held him for ransom for $25,000. Since kidnapping had been an infrequent crime, Nebraska had no kidnapping statute. Because of this, Crowe was tried and acquitted on other charges. Although many professed outrage at the verdicts, Crowe had become something of a folk hero. On this episode, we explore this crime in the 1976 article titled A Really Spectacular and Truly Named Desperado, Pat Crowe and the Cudahy Kidnapping by Garneth Oldenkamp Peterson. The early years of the 20th century have been pictured as happy, lazy years, a time of simple and uncomplicated life. Among the idyllic recollections are band concerts in the square, bicycle rides on a tandem with a sweetheart, and afternoons spent cheering the local baseball team. But, like all memories, the picture given us of the first decade of this century is distorted. A closer look at this period reveals facets often overlooked. One was the violence of everyday life. On December 22nd, 1900, the headlines of one newspaper's front page screamed, "In cowshed with throat cut. Schoolgirl hangs herself. War Office auditor murdered," and even a single paragraph article was headlined Death and Burglary. Such headlines were not exceptional, but daily occurrences, and their frequency seemed to point to an interest in crime by most readers. As the only important information agency, newspapers wielded great influence in 1900. Omaha had 3 daily newspapers, which mirrored its expanding commerce and industry. Through Omaha, a railroad center since the 1870s, moved the agricultural products and manufactured goods of the Midwest. By the turn of the century, Omaha grew rapidly as great numbers of immigrants, Germans from Russia, Italians, Czechs, and others, moved into the city. Earlier immigrant groups, Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, found jobs in one of Omaha's major industries, such as in packing plants or on railroads. By 1900, urban growth produced class divisions between labor and management. Although workers were not fixed in a rigid class structure, only about 1/4 of them in 1900 could hope to advance to white-collar status. Within the previous 25 years, men such as John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie built their fortunes and earned for themselves the title of robber barons. As frontier cities of the West attracted industry and gained an urban character, the process of division into owner and worker continued. Omaha's transportation and meatpacking industries brought in transients and some unsavory characters. With the number of people moving in and out of the city, the incidence of crime increased. On the night of December 18th, 1900, a crime took place that shocked Omaha and raised interest across the United States. A ne'er-do-well named Pat Crowe and an associate kidnapped Edward A. Cudahy Jr., son of a wealthy Omaha meatpacker, and held him for a $25,000 ransom. This crime had a greater impact on the average citizen than did most crimes because it evoked sympathy for a boy of 15 snatched from his family by criminals. Prior to the kidnapping, Pat Crowe already had behind him a string of crimes and flamboyant escapes with one characteristic to all of them: his steady nerve under pressure. He had started in the butcher business in 1886 at the age of 17 after coming to Omaha from his parents' farm near Vale, Iowa. Crowe and his business partner, Kavanaugh, allowed their working-class customers to fall behind on their bills. Their little butcher shop closed when it could not survive competition from a Cudahy retail outlet. Crowe vowed to make the wealthy Cudahy, quote, pay for this someday and pay well, end quote. Not yet 20 years old, Pat ended up working in the Cudahy retail store. He quickly discovered how easy it was to borrow money from the till, a habit which cost him his job. From that time on, Pat and crime were companions. Intending to start another butcher shop in Davenport, Iowa, Pat went to Chicago to buy tools. His trip ended in a brothel. When he awoke the next day, he found his $750 gone. He retaliated by robbing the madam of a sum greater than he lost. He continued in crime in Denver and Kansas City, stealing diamonds worth $6,000. By 1892, Crowe relocated in Philadelphia, where he first heard about the unsolved kidnapping of Charlie Ross. New York City police had convinced young Ross's father to withhold the ransom and allow the police to find the boy. Crowe spent a profitable summer in Philadelphia and in New Jersey seaside resorts robbing summer guests, but the Ross story continued to intrigue him. He vowed to gain revenge on Edward Cudahy, although revenge was probably secondary to profit by this time. Pat returned to the Midwest, but did not implement the long-considered plan until 1900. On the evening of December 18th, young Eddie Cudahy left his home at 518 South 37th Street to return some books to Mrs. C.B. Rustin at her home 3 blocks away. When Edward Cudahy and his wife returned from an evening with friends about 10 o'clock, they expressed surprise that their son had not yet returned. Cudahy was dismayed to learn from the Rustins that Eddie had left their home promptly after delivering the books. Worry increased when Eddie's collie dog returned home alone. This indicated the boy must have left the neighborhood in a streetcar or other vehicle, for the dog always waited outside a house if his master stopped. Cudahy called the police at 12 o'clock midnight, whereupon Chief of Police J.J. Donahue decided Eddie had been kidnapped. Melville Sears, Cudahy's attorney, organized search parties and alerted hospitals and railroad stations to watch for the boy. Cudahy told police to, quote, spare no expense in their quest, end quote. He telegraphed Chicago requesting the aid of Pinkerton detectives. Various theories on Eddie's whereabouts arose. The Omaha Evening World Herald described Cudahy as a, quote, quiet, industrious boy of the best habits, end quote. And Edward Cudahy believed his son would, quote, never cause his mother so much trouble by straying away without his consent, end quote. The police put Eddie's friends under surveillance. One boy had been seen at 56th and Center Streets, the extreme limits of the city. The previous evening, a companion, presumably Eddie, had been seen with him. This heightened concern because places of bad repute were located in that area. The kidnapping theory proved true on the morning of the 19th when Andrew Gray, a Cudahy coachman, found a ransom note on the family lawn. Shortly thereafter, Cudahy received a phone call from a man who asked if the note had been found. Cudahy had the call traced to Glenn's Livery Stable on Leavenworth Street. The police failed to apprehend the caller, but Frank Glenn described the caller and the bay pony he rode. The police only allowed a small portion of the note to appear in the newspapers. Quote, Mr. E.A. Cudahy, your son is safe. We have him and will take good care of him and will return him to you in consideration of the payment of $25,000. We mean business, Jack. End quote. The full note described the location for delivery of the ransom, and it contained a threat to blind Eddie with acid if the directions were unheeded. Written so as to, quote, harrow the feelings of his parents, end quote, the note recalled the unsolved case of Charlie Ross and threatened the same fate for Eddie if the money demands were not met. In retrospect, one of the most interesting aspects of the case concerned its newspaper treatment. The Omaha Daily News gave the straightest report, running the story in column 1, page 1, with the conservative headline. The Omaha Daily Bee ran a 1-column story, although the Bee generally supplied more information than the news. The Evening World Herald, the most zealous, frequently placed stories in both the right and left-hand columns with extra-large headlines. Throughout the case, the World Herald, obviously setting out to sell papers, printed every rumor, every clue, and related incident. The suspense over the kidnapping did not last long. by December 20th, Eddie had been returned home safely. The World Herald announced in headlines that the kidnapping resembled a thrilling novel and that Eddie had been seized, bound, and chained to floor of cottage. Eddie's description of his captivity sounded tame in comparison to the headlines. As one who, quote, apparently suffered least from this terrible experience, end quote, Eddie appeared to the World Herald reporters as happy withal and perfectly enjoying the sensation of which he was the piece de resistance. Eddie had returned home shortly after 1 o'clock a.m. December 20th, approximately 30 hours after the kidnapping occurred. He explained that he had been walking home from the Rustins when two men approached him. Posing as sheriffs from Sayes County, they accused him of being Eddie McGee, an escaped reform school inmate who had stolen money from his aunt. Although Eddie protested that his name was Cudahy, the two would not let him go, claiming he had to be identified by the sheriff. The three traveled south by buggy on 37th Street until they reached Leavenworth Street, where Eddie saw a streetcar whose conductor could identify him. Eddie told this to his captors, who immediately blindfolded the boy and turned west on Leavenworth. They traveled variously on rough roads and paved roads until Eddie surmised that they were somewhere in South Omaha. He pointed out that, quote, 2 or 3 whiffs from the packing house district assured me that my conjecture was correct, end quote. The group soon arrived at the captivity house where the two men led Eddie up rickety stairs to a room with no furniture. His captors fastened leg irons on his ankles to keep him from escaping. Eddie said he laid down for about 5 hours and attempted to sleep, but his nerves were too badly shattered to permit of it. He was given coffee and crackers by a guard who was drinking heavily. Eddie said that the guard became garrulous after 6 or 7 hours and that, quote, his talk rambled, though whether from drink or design I could not say, end quote. The guard spoke with a strong Irish brogue, and from his conversation, Eddie gathered that 6 men made up the gang. One man who came from Mexico and Denver was, quote, an expert in the kidnapping business, end quote. The guard said his partners really wanted to kidnap Eddie's sisters, but were unsuccessful and settled for the boy. On Wednesday, the guard became angry when a partner who had gone to pick up the ransom returned with $5,000, pleading that he fell into a creek and lost $20,000. Soon afterward, the men brought Eddie to 36th and Leavenworth, where his guard threatened to shoot his partner if the money was not divided fairly. After removing his blindfold, Eddie ran home. Meanwhile, Edward Cudahy had been making plans to comply with the instructions in the note. Chief Donahue and the Cudahy attorneys urged him not to meet the demands because the kidnappers might fail to return Eddie even if they had the money. But Cudahy felt confident the men meant business, and that afternoon sent Melville Sears to the Omaha National Bank for $25,000 in gold. Placed in a bank grip inside a white wheat sack, the money was taken 5 miles out on West Center Road at 7 p.m. A lantern tied with black and white ribbons marked the drop-off point. Although Cudahy did not mention it at first, he later admitted he was not alone, as specified. He was accompanied by P.J. McGrath, a livestock buyer at the South Omaha packing plant. Cudahy enclosed the ransom note with the money, as the kidnappers had demanded, and a letter of his own in which he, quote, called attention to the fact that he had complied with their requests and demands to the very letter, and expected them to keep their part of the bargain, end quote. The two returned home about 9:30 p.m. Cudahy suggested that the 2 police officers on duty at the house stay out of sight to avoid scaring off any messengers or persons returning Eddie. The officers adjourned to the barn behind the house and missed the excitement, not realizing Eddie returned until Cudahy told them at 1:15 a.m. Newspapers reported some interesting contradictions on December 20th and 21st. Attorney Melville Sears stated there was absolutely no truth in the story that Cudahy drove out to the city last night in a carriage with a red light attached to it and paid the ransom. Cudahy's story appeared immediately below that interview, recounting his trip and the fact that he did pay the ransom. The account left Sears red-faced, and the next day he explained that he knew of the ransom payment, but not that the story could be made public. Another discrepancy concerned Mrs. Cudahy's opinion of the police. she doubted, quote, whether the police are not in standing with the criminals, end quote. The report claimed the captors were informed of police action and so informed Eddie. Mrs. Cudahy supposedly stated that she would, quote, like to see them, the criminals, hung and would be willing to pull on the rope, end quote. Edward Cudahy, discounting such fiery statements, said, quote, Mrs. Cudahy believes nothing of the kind. There are some features of journalism that ought to be discouraged, and one of which this assertion is based is one of them, end quote. In the attempts to capitalize on the Cudahy story, the newspapers built up rivalries. The News reported that Chief Donahue knew the criminals involved and could, quote, put them under arrest at any time if Mr. Cudahy wishes, end quote. The Bee followed with a statement from Chief Donahue calling the news report absolutely false. Cudahy felt it was, quote, his duty to prosecute the scoundrels to the fullest extent of the law, end quote, and on December 21st offered $5,000 for the arrest and conviction of any one of the kidnappers, $15,000 for two, and $25,000 for three, if indeed three men were involved in the case. Cudahy promised he would leave no stone unturned in his efforts to make things too hot for them around Omaha. The World Herald and the News reported that the police sought Pat Crowe because a reputable citizen who knew Crowe remembered that Pat had discussed kidnapping a child of wealthy parents and demanding ransom. Because the citizen did not know the contents of the ransom note, the informant's tip pointed to Crowe. Police continued searching for the house in South Omaha where Eddie had been held and the horse and buggy used to transport him. After locating the house, they planned to secure descriptions from neighbors of any strangers seen in the area. Chief Donahue explained why the police did not lie in wait for the thieves near the lantern in the country. They believed capture of the kidnappers only a secondary goal, the first being Eddie's safe return. Donahue further stated that the police department did, quote, nothing that was not in compliance with Mr. Cudahy's wishes, end quote, and felt Cudahy judged wisely in paying the ransom. Chicago police did not agree, charging Cudahy with setting a dangerous precedent and predicting a series of sensational kidnapping cases would follow. They contended that eventually, quote, rich men will have to employ servants to act as bodyguards for their young ones, end quote. This fear was evident in Omaha, and several wealthy families did hire private detectives. On December 22nd, a search party located the Captivity House in a lonesome locality at 3604 Grover Street in South Omaha. Eddie identified the house by the broken stair steps and by articles strewn about the room. Searchers found cigar stubs and burnt matches, as well as sugar and coffee and a well bucket from which Eddie drank. Tacks used to fasten newspapers over the windows remained on the sills. The police obtained descriptions of strange men seen in the area. B.K. Munshaw and his daughter Maud of 3640 Grover Street reported a light-complexioned man with blonde hair had asked about the house 2 weeks before. The Munshaw's statement led police to the owners of the house, the James Schneiderwins. Mrs. Schneiderwin had spoken with a light-complexioned man who gave the alias James L. Connor, the name of Crowe's brother-in-law, and rented the house for $6 a month. These statements brought Pat Crowe firmly into the case. The World Herald described Crowe as, quote, one of the most picturesque criminals in the country because of his daring and the magnitude of his adventures, end quote. Since the beginning of the Cudahy affair, the World Herald had taken every opportunity to mention any failure of the police department. Under the heading of Police Are Amusing, the paper gleefully reported the scare the reporters had given Chief Donahue, Cudahy, and the search party when they arrived at the Captivity House. The reporters had been inside when one startled Chief Donahue struggled to draw his revolver. According to the World Herald, quote, had the reporter been in the bandit's shoes with a firm grip of his gold and the other with a loaded revolver, the chief would have been a trifle slow in getting his eye over the muzzle of his revolver, end quote. The police chief, it developed, found out about the house through a boy who had seen reporters there earlier. The newspaper criticized the chief for inactivity while the bandits, quote, passed through the highways and byways of the well-protected city of Omaha, end quote. General John C. Corwin, another Cudahy attorney, exasperated matters between police and the press by publishing special thanks to the World Herald reporters. Quote, "There is no better detective in the world than the sharp, shrewd, energetic, ubiquitous newspaper man," end quote. Perhaps the World Herald report was biased, but the news also credited two reporters with locating the house and said the police department failed to uncover substantial clues. On Christmas Day, the Livery Stables Bay pony ridden by the deliverer of the ransom note was located in Pacific Junction, Iowa, 20 miles southeast of Omaha. The police tried to bring the pony to Omaha, but Pacific Junction residents refused to release it unless paid the reward for producing evidence. John F. Code, a Pacific Junction farmer, supposedly brought the news of the horse to Omaha. This item caused conflict between the World Herald and other Omaha newspapers. Both the News and the Bee credited Code with reporting the story to police. The World Herald, however, charged the Bee with stealing news from the World Herald and creating a fictitious John Code in order to raise circulation. Code was real, however. Reports on him not only appear in the Bee, but also in the News. The World Herald made another accusation. On December 23rd, both the Bee and the News reported descriptions of the kidnappers given by August Schlem, a farmer on Grover Street. The World Herald charged that he was also mythical, a creation of a reporter looking for a scoop. When the newspapers battled for primacy, someone discovered that no Nebraska law covered the Cudahy crime. Oddly enough, the New York Times had more to say on the question than the Omaha newspapers. Kidnapping in Nebraska, it said, carried a sentence ranging from 2 to 7 years, applicable only when the intent was to transport the victim out of the state. Another Nebraska offense, child stealing, applied only to the abduction of children under 10 years of age. The only charge the police seemed to have against the Cudahy kidnapper was false imprisonment, a misdemeanor subject only to a fine and jail sentence. At the discovery of this omission, senators introduced corrective bills in the state legislature. Senator Frank T. Ransom of Omaha introduced a bill providing life imprisonment for extortionists and death for threats or actual injuries to the victim. Senator Nathan V. Harlan's bill set punishment from 1 to 20 years for the abduction of a child under 18. Both bills became law on March 30th, 1901. Police alternately searched for clues and parried criticism for inactivity. One critic said the nadir of police prestige occurred when two farm boys had found the lantern used by the kidnappers to signal Cudahy. The Bee termed it, quote, an interesting addition to the abduction museum in the chief's office, which is growing rapidly, end quote. Meanwhile, in Pacific Junction, a quarrel had developed over ownership of the pony. Both Joseph Goodrich and Mrs. Bertha Mack claimed possession of the animal. Since Goodrich held the pony, Mrs. Mack took the issue to court. A Pacific Junction judge would not allow the horse moved without a $100 deposit. Chief Donahue charged that there seemed to be a steady effort to impede in the case. Reports of Pat Crowe came in from everywhere. He was supposedly seen in Chicago, on an ocean liner, at Nantucket Beach, Rhode Island, and in St. Joseph, Missouri. Chief Donahue felt Crowe was too well known in St. Joseph to hide there successfully. Both Chief Donahue and the Cudahy family received crank letters daily. Some letter writers claimed to have been involved, were denied a share of the ransom money, and would turn informant for a price. The newspapers gave most attention to the Eloise T. letters, so called because of their signatures, which taunted the police for failure to solve the case. The Daily News ridiculed the police for their attempt to bring the pony to Omaha, questioning the value of the action. If the pony went unclaimed, it could surmise the kidnappers were owners, and possessing the horse in any event had little to do with solving the mystery surrounding the abductors. If someone claimed the pony, it will likewise be settled that the pony did not belong to the abductors, another important bit of evidence. In front page editorial a few days later, the paper asked, "Do they really want Pat Crowe?" The editorial said police did not seem to be trying to find Pat and had used him as a scapegoat because they had no leads which cast doubt upon the sincerity of the police in hunting for him. The paper ridiculed Chief Donahue and said he would probably be flustered completely if Crowe appeared to prove his innocence. Meanwhile, $100 was pledged to bring the pony from Pacific Junction. The police planned a search for the smith who shot it in hopes of getting a description of the horse's owner. Joseph Goodrich of Pacific Junction threatened to prevent the movement of the mount across the state line. Fortunately, Goodrich waited in Council Bluffs where B.F. Warren, one owner of the horse, rode it over the East Omaha Bridge farther north on New Year's Day. After the exhausting ride from Pacific Junction, the horse required the services of a veterinarian. On January 30th, news of yet another threatening letter to the Cudahys shocked the community. On January 30th, news of yet another threatening letter to the Cudahys shocked the community. Delivered by the postman rather than by writer, the letter bore a postmark of December 22nd. Cudahy had withheld any news of the letter at first, but finally it was released to the press. Quote, Cudahy, if you value the boy's life at the price of a bullet, you will withdraw the reward at once and let well enough alone. If you don't do this, we will finish the job with a bullet. If any man, whether guilty or innocent, is ever arrested, a bullet will close the boy's mouth. You think this a warning when it's too late, end quote. The letter failed to deter Cudahy, who stated he had, quote, not withdrawn the reward and did not propose to, end quote. The Omaha City Council called a special session to set its own reward for the criminals. The council asked Cudahy to withdraw his reward for his family's safety. They, in turn, would set up one to take its place. The council offered $8,000 for the arrest and conviction of one of the criminals, $15,000 for two, and $25,000 for three. Cudahy announced his reward would stand, thereby bringing the total to $50,000. Unsolicited, Brigadier General Anson Mills of Washington, D.C. added another $500 to the fund. The council even planned to ask the county and the governor to offer rewards. The council felt it must act, believing that the eyes of the world were turned on Omaha. The first months of 1901 brought a continuation of the crank letters and reports of Crowe. He was reported to be on Bellevue Island, in Creston, Iowa, and on a steamer Dudley, bound for Honduras. Near Shatter, Nebraska, a man was trailed to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where he was discovered to be a Boston curio collector. Police arrested John Crowe, Pat's brother, from Council Bluffs, but released him when Eddie Cudahy could not identify him. A hypnotist offered his services. The chief felt he may do some good. Reporters in jest said that some people say the hypnotist may have begun operations on the chief. The first breakthrough occurred on February 19th with the arrest of James Callahan of Omaha as Crowe's accomplice. Callahan had worked for Cudahys at one time. Suspicion turned to him because he was seen with Crowe prior to the kidnapping and had spent freely since the crime. His previous criminal record consisted only of several petite larceny cases, but police knew him as a member of the Q Street Gang. He was described as a typical hobo, with a swagger and a slipshod shuffle, and Eddie Cudahy readily identified him as his talkative guard with the Irish brogue, remarking that he could, quote, pick him out of 1,000, end quote. The charges brought against Callahan included false imprisonment, grand larceny and robbery, and bond for each crime was set at $2,500. The trial began on April 23rd. Eddie Cudahy and his father served as witnesses, along with Callahan himself. Although under examination for 2 hours while the prosecuting attorney's questions came, quote, with the rapidity of balls from a Gatling gun, end quote, Callahan consistently claimed he was in Arf's saloon the evening of the kidnapping. The judge charged the jury to determine whether Callahan robbed Edward Cudahy by putting fear in him and thereby forcing him to give up the money for fear of his son's welfare. The jury returned a not guilty verdict for Callahan. When the overjoyed prisoner asked permission to thank the jurors, the judge retorted that the jurors, quote, did not deserve any thanks, end quote. The judge proceeded to show his disgust by stating that he could not conceive of 12 intelligent men returning a verdict of this kind. He continued his statement by pointing out that juries should protect people and society, not make heroes of men who prey upon people and upon their property. He then discharged the 12 without the compliments of the court, adding that he hoped that they would never be called again to serve as jurors. Men such as Edward Cudahy echoed the judge's sentiments of the verdict, remarking that it was incomprehensible that 12 men would wholly ignore such convincing evidence. Chief Donahue felt very much chagrined at the verdict and suggested the rewards be dropped so there would be no inductment of any witnesses to stretch his testimony. Callahan remained in custody, although he could not be tried on the other charges because of acquittal on the robbery charge. The court later charged him with 7 counts of perjury in the robbery trial, but a jury again found him not guilty. Soon after the Callahan trial, Cudahy received a letter from Elgin, Illinois, this time from an agent of the kidnapper. The letter offered to return $21,000 if Cudahy would withdraw his $25,000 reward. The letter intrigued Cudahy, who went to Chicago to deal with the agent. Cudahy eventually refused to withdraw the offer, claiming he would spend his last $1,000 rather than compromise. The only word of Pat Crowe during the summer of 1901 surfaced in July when the New York Times reported him in South Africa fighting in the Boer War. Crowe had sent a payment of $250 to a St. Joseph, Missouri lawyer who once defended him on a robbery charge, and the letter bore a Johannesburg postmark. In October, Crowe contacted Chief Donahue through a messenger, promising to surrender if the $50,000 reward was withdrawn and his bond reduced to $500. Crowe reasoned there would be less chance of witnesses manufacturing incidents in order to gain part of the reward. Finally, Edward Cudahy and the city withdrew their rewards, but no judge would release Crowe at a $500 bond. The Des Moines Capital, especially critical of the police, commented that even though the public was not supposed to be able to understand the workings of officers of the law, the thick-headed public will persist in wondering who this individual is who can saunter back and forth as this special messenger of Pat Crowe. The Capitol wanted to take advantage of the messenger to trace Crowe and, quote, took little stock in the practice of compromising with thugs, end quote. The plan called for Crowe to surrender by November 1st. When he failed to appear, the World Herald observed that Crowe had succeeded in having the price on his head withdrawn, allowing him to meander about the country feeling some $50,000 safer. The Herald believed most widely advertised and persistently hunted fugitive of many generations to be hiding in Omaha, and said his exchange of courtesies with the Omaha police is apt to pass down into history as one of the most humorous passages in the annals of crime. The Daily News pointed out that although Crowe was dangerous, one cannot but respect the infinite genius of the man. He is a character unique in criminal annals. Crowe suddenly turned up in Omaha in the spring of 1905 and gave an exclusive interview to a World Herald reporter. He was, quote, weary of living as a fugitive and anxious to begin a new life, end quote, and really meant to reform. Crowe offered to give himself up but would not admit involvement in the kidnapping. Once free, he planned to enter the saloon business, believing it the only occupation in which he could stand a show of success. Nothing came of the interview. He slipped into Omaha, made his plea for sympathy, but slipped out quietly again. Chief Donahue personally offered a reward of $200 for the arrest and delivery of Pat Crowe to the police department. Crowe became a suspect again in July of 1905 when gunmen robbed 2 Council Bluffs streetcars of about $50. A man fitting Crowe's description had been observed in a nearby house. Crowe appeared in Omaha on September 6, 1905, and wounded patrolman A.H. Jackson in a gunfight on South 16th Street. While outside a saloon, Crowe and his brother-in-law, Frank Murphy, had seen 4 out-of-uniform policemen approaching, and a shootout resulted. After wounding Jackson, Pat again escaped. Finally, on October 2nd, 1905, outside a saloon in the Tenderloin section of Butte, Montana, detectives nabbed Crowe. He put up no fight but, quote, cursed bitterly, expressing chagrin at his arrest in a town the size of Butte, end quote. Everyone wanted to see the famous kidnapper. Women even brought him fruits and flowers. Crowe enjoyed his notoriety and told the jailer to let all visitors in to see him, since, quote, he did not know when he would again come to Butte, end quote. The wily bandit chose not to fight extradition and soon left for Omaha with 15,000 people at the station to see him depart and with the curious at many stations en route. The Omaha Daily News sent a correspondent to cover Crowe's return. Crowds were so large at Rawlins, Wyoming, that detectives were forced to almost fight their way to the hotel with their prisoner. In Green River, Wyoming, the sheriff of Sweetwater County boarded the train and rode to Rock Springs to become acquainted with the man he considered the most famous outlaw in America. At North Platte, a resident claimed Crowe attracted, quote, more attention than President Roosevelt did, end quote. Unaccountably, the estimated crowd of 300 in Omaha appeared almost subdued, although some chanted, hooray for Pat Crowe at his arrival. Pat faced trial December of 1905 for shooting with intent to kill or wound Officer Jackson in the battle on 16th Street. The 4-day trial ended in Crowe's acquittal because the court could not determine who fired first, and therefore whether or not Crowe had shot in self-defense. Crowe's trial for robbery from Edward Cudahy of $25,000 by putting him in fear began in Douglas County District Court in February 1906. J.P. English and A.S. Ritchie served as Crowe's attorneys. In choosing the jury, County Attorney W.W. Slabaugh asked each juror whether or not the fact that Mr. Cudahy was reputed to be very wealthy would have any influence on the final judgment of the case. At the same time Crowe was on trial in Omaha for robbery, Edward Cudahy and other meatpackers were being tried in Chicago under a restraint of trade charge. Slabaugh saw that under the circumstances, a jury of laboring men in the Crowe trial would be unfavorable to Cudahy. Slabaugh's questioning failed to secure the type of jury he desired. However, he faced essentially a working man's jury consisting of men from such varied occupations as a packing house employee, sign painter, delivery clerk, and cigar dealer. Edward Cudahy took the stand and became quite emotional in his recalling of the story. He stated that he gave up the money for his son because, quote, they had threatened to burn out his eyes with acid and cut his ears off, and I was afraid that he would be murdered, end quote. Eddie Cudahy also testified, but there had been quite a change in his appearance. No longer little Eddie, the kidnapped victim, he had grown over 6 feet tall, with a bass voice as big as its professor and the appearance of being entirely able to give any kidnapper quite an argument before reaching any basis of compromise. In the course of his testimony, Eddie recalled his guard's threat to shoot his partner if he did not get his fair share of the money. At this statement, Crowe, quote, could not keep his face straight and covered it with his hand for a minute or so to conceal his very evident amusement, end quote. Various other witnesses involved in the case testified, but no one could be certain of Crowe's identity after a hiatus of 5 years. Eventually, the case worked down to the details of the pony and the lantern, which the news fictitiously reported. Albert Ayers, who owned the pony when it died, explained that the animal staggered, then finally laid down and pointed its toes toward Pacific Junction, gave up its spirit. The prosecution introduced perhaps the most important evidence of the trial on February 13th. Crowe had written a letter to his family priest, a Father Murphy of Vale, Iowa, in 1904, in which he had asked the priest to intercede for him with the Cudahys. In the letter, Pat confessed his guilt in the kidnapping and asked for a chance to start a new life. Crowe recalled that he had shown, quote, mercy to the rich and mighty when they were in my power, end quote, probably referring to the Cudahy kidnapping. He also testified that he had attempted to return $21,000 of the ransom money, an offer Cudahy rejected. Crowe wanted to plead guilty and have his sentence suspended or relieve himself of, quote, the burden that is crushing out the last ray of happiness in my waste of life, end quote. A legal battle arose over whether the letter could be admitted to the court. The defense claimed that the letter was a privileged communication between a church member and his priest. The court, however, eventually ruled in favor of the prosecution because Crowe had been seeking earthly, not spiritual relief, and wanted the priest to serve as an intermediary in a business transaction. The confession letter so satisfied Slawbaugh that he dismissed several important witnesses and allowed the case to go to the jury. Each attorney finished with involved closing remarks. Assistant County Attorney F.W. Fitch urged the jurors to bring in a verdict that would, quote, be a credit to them in the afterlife and the state of Nebraska, end quote. Most memorable were the remarks of defense attorney A.S. Ritchie. A writer later referred to the speech as an old-fashioned 2-hour oration that crackled with such words as irrefragable, chimerical, and animadvert, and touched on the history of law, the Catholic Church, Martin Luther, Old Glory, and Abraham Lincoln. But Ritchie's main attack centered on Cudahy as a wealthy businessman and his connection with the Beef Trust trial in Chicago. Ritchie's harangue may have been the deciding factor. On February 16th, the jury found Pat Crowe not guilty of robbery. The overfilled courtroom applauded the verdict, causing Judge A.L. Sutton to clear the court and announce his surprise, quote, that such cheering should follow the announcement of the acquittal of a notorious criminal, end quote. Newspapers printed comments from townspeople that resembled those of the judge and reflected the social class of those interviewed. Men asked to comment included the mayor, attorneys, insurance agent, druggist, furrier, county assessor, and superintendent of Associated Charities. Of the 44 people asked to comment, 31 expressed surprise at the verdict and felt it an outrage. A women's group also met to protest their indignation and protestation of the acquittal verdict. Although the report specified that the meeting concerned all Omaha women and not club women exclusively, the list of officers chosen reflected the more well-to-do of the city. Chief Donahue, in high temper, did not conceal his contempt for the jurors, stating it was a pity that no law existed to prosecute them for neglect of their duty and send them all to jail. For one in so high a position in the city, the chief was clearly undiplomatic in expressing his beliefs on the case. Attorneys of the city banded together in an attempt to keep the men of the Crowe jury off any other cases, calling their verdict a travesty of justice. And one well-known businessman charged Crowe's acquittal to yellow journalism, pointing out that, quote, these papers have made him out to be a hero, end quote. One citizen felt certain the verdict showed the growing spirit of socialism. Many believe the jury voted against Cudahy because of the feelings against the Beef Trust. The World Herald commented that the jury saw Crowe as a modern Robin Hood, with Cudahy in the role of the modern Baron. Indeed, class consciousness seemed to be at the heart of the matter. One person asked to comment on the Crowe acquittal replied, quote, it was nothing more than we could expect from the jury, composed, as it was, largely of laboring men. Cudahy, in their minds, is robbing the people in small amounts 3 times a day, and Pat Crowe got back a part of this money in one big chunk and didn't hurt anybody at all. There is no doubt but that the jury thought it no worse to steal one's child than to starve many, end quote. An Omaha lawyer echoed that statement and expressed no surprise after the verdict either, because of the character of the jury. He remarked that they probably thought that Crowe was taking the money from one who had himself filched it from others. In the meantime, police escorted Crowe to a Council Bluffs jail where he was charged with the streetcar robbery from the previous July. Crowe, jubilant over his acquittal, entered the cell corridor as jauntily as if being shown to the best room in a hotel. Over 200 people came to visit the famous criminal. Crowe told reporters that he had been offered $500 a month to join a theatrical company, but had not decided whether or not to accept the offer. Lawyers were able to postpone his trial, and by February 21st, officials released Crowe on bail. The trial did not occur until May of 1907, when again, a jury acquitted Crowe in his 2-day trial. A key witness did not appear, perhaps because Pat had been observed at her house for a considerable time Sunday afternoon and evening, and again in the early hours of Monday morning during the week of the trial. The record of Crowe's life after the Council Bluffs trial is sketchy. By October of 1906, Crowe had published a book entitled Pat Crowe, His Story, Confession, and Reformation, in which he admitted his guilt in the Cudahy kidnapping. The book also included A.S. Ritchie's address to the jury, the lengthy speech filling over half of the book. In 1919, Eddie Cudahy married Margaret Carey in Chicago, where he served as vice president of the packing company. Crowe, in New York City working for the Salvation Army, sent a congratulatory telegram to Eddie, which said, quote, "Nobody can wish you greater happiness in the hands of your new kidnapper than do I. Here's hoping you cherish no ill will over our former escapade and enjoy this one even more," end quote. Crowe became a lecturer on crime and at various times throughout the 1920s spoke to presidents, or so he claimed, about prison reform and training for children. In 1922, he advocated the vocational training of the country's youth on 40-acre farms and 10-acre chicken ranches. In 1927, he wrote another book, Spreading Evil, in which he told his life story and warned boys not to follow his example. Crowe intended the proceeds from the book to go toward a national publicity campaign in the interest of America's underprivileged youth. Of course, he had other problems over the years. Police arrested him as a beggar on a subway in 1925. The judge gave him a suspended sentence, and the court took upon a collection and sent him on his way. Pat only commented that honesty is the best policy and it pays to advertise. In 1935, he was back in Omaha and apprehended on a drunkenness charge. His old lawyer, A.S. Ritchie, came out of a 2-year retirement to successfully defend him on the charge. Just before he died, Crowe worked as an attraction in a penny arcade off Times Square in New York City. He died of a heart attack in a Harlem rooming house on October 29, 1938. Scrapbooks filled with yellowed clippings of his escapades were the only belongings found in his room. The books were probably his only contact with reality, since by the time of his death he had become a shaking alcoholic. Pat Crowe never seemed truly malicious, but rather committed his robberies for the money involved and for the daring and skill necessary to pull them off. The Cudahy kidnapping was only one of these escapades, and it appears Crowe probably never did hold a grudge against Edward Cudahy, but instead saw him as an easy route to money. The laboring classes apparently sympathized with Crowe because of his ability to steal from the rich, from diamonds to children, and get away with it. The newspapers in 1906 pictured the new aristocrats of the American class system, men such as Edward Cudahy, as capitalists who stole from the poor to increase profits. It was no wonder that a combination of working man resentment of the rich and a press generally favorable to Pat Crowe produced a jury capable of acquitting him of theft from Cudahy, the Midwest version of the robber baron. The people made Crowe a folk hero, which explained why crowds gathered to greet his train in every little town from Butte to Omaha. In his own fashion, Pat Crowe was perhaps one of the last of the American folk heroes, a picturesque man who outwitted both the police and the Pinkertons and stole from the rich. He carried off his operations, quote, with a dash and abandon of daredeviltry that marked the deeds of the picturesque old scoundrels of the days before civilization laid them on the shelf, end quote. By the time of his death, the country that had experienced World War I and the Great Depression had no interest in scoundrels of an earlier age. His end as an alcoholic in a Harlem rooming house somehow seemed unfitting for a criminal the Omaha Daily News described as one of the few really spectacular and truly named desperados of the day. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about the Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.